Welcome to our final learning lab on addressing the structural drivers of HIV. This is going to be presented by Strive Research Co-Director, who is Professor Janet Seeley, Professor of Anthropology and Health at London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. My name is Saidi Kapiga. I'm the Research Co-Director of Strive and the Scientific Director of the Mwanza Intervention Trials Unit in Mwanza, northwestern Tanzania. So Strive, as you may know, is a research consortium funded by DFID to tackle structural drivers of HIV. The consortia partners in India, Tanzania, South Africa, US, and at the school in London have conducted research in a range of structural factors, including alcohol, transactional sex, gender norms, stigma, and violence. And today, Janet will try and bring together the different considerable work which have been done by members of the consortia over the past 8 years, and specifically present the highlights from the consortia's research and synthesis. Janet have worked at the school for the past 5 years and have been a research co-director for Strive since 2016. She has been actively engaged in research on HIV since the late 1980s, and she's based in Uganda. And the presentation will be followed by questions and discussions, so feel free to type questions onto the chat box as you think of them, and we will pick them at the end. And we will have a question and answer sessions after the presentations. Janet, let me hand it over to you now.
Okay, so thank you, Michael, for rescuing us. So as I was saying, and nobody could hear me, this is a very rapid run through the synthesis, and just the good news is everything I'm going to say is covered in a synthesis document, which is now on the website. Can I just confirm, Saidi, that you can hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you. Thank you.
Great, fantastic. Okay. So a quick run through the structure, addressing the structural drivers of HIV. This is the broad structure that I'm following, which indeed follows the chapters in our synthesis. So firstly, significant progress against HIV has been made, but barriers remain. And what we have been looking at over the last 8 years is addressing those barriers, the entrenched gender inequalities, violence, poverty, stigmatization, and issues around alcohol as one example of trying to address key promoters of HIV infection. What are structural drivers? It's a question we're often asked, and you can think of them as being the structures that shape the context in which patterns of individual risk behavior take place. So you're at your individual level, as this nice slide shows. You can be told to drink less, but actually at a structural level, if the price of alcohol is increased, then you may not be able to afford it so easily, and that may help you drink less. So it's something that can actually promote a change, a structural intervention used in HIV to describe the range of factors acting at the macro and community levels that influence and shape the patterns of HIV risk behavior. If you look at our conceptual framework, you can see that a little more clearly. At the top, you've got the macro level and the community level, mapping the relationships between the macro and community level, the interpersonal and the individual risk factors, and the proximal determinants of risk and HIV transmission. So if you can intervene at the structural level, then you can influence what is happening as you go down the conceptual framework. one of the critical things that we have been doing is looking at conceptualizing social norms. And there's been a body of work around working groups, around looking at those social norms and how those social norms are related to harmful practices, and how we can influence and change and influence those norms by being able to measure them more effectively. So this, as you can see, things that you would be able to find on the website, the work on the social norms sustaining child marriage, around intimate partner violence, the three projects named here. Two of them I'll talk about a little more as I go through. We've also had the work around the briefing papers on the synthesizing a body of knowledge through the technical briefs, and those also can be found on the website. So let me just start with thinking about HIV stigma. So HIV-related stigma and discrimination hampers efforts to prevent new HIV infections and engage people living with HIV in care and treatment. This is well known. So one of the bodies of work that we've done, led by colleagues at ICRW and with their broader network, is the development of a new framework called the Health Stigma and Discrimination Framework. And that framework builds on existing conceptualization of health-related stigma and on the practical experience of the people who have been working on stigma for really out of work for over the last 10 years, so predating STRIVE. So it enables, you can read for yourselves, standardizing the measures, being able to explore multiple health issues, and then looking at the links between social and structural pathways, etc. But also trying to look at both the stigmatized and the stigmatizer, not actually differentiating between those sort of groups, because it's often quite blurred and unclear. So if we look at the framework itself, it looks quite complicated, but if you look at in the middle, the manifestations, you've got stigma experiences and stigma practices that are influenced by the stigma marking, by the drivers and facilitators of stigma, and then the outcomes. So that gives you some ideas of the areas in which one might try to intervene to influence stigma. So a mass communication effort, for example, may be used to help populations understand a health condition better, to dispel the myths of how the disease is transmitted and who is at risk. And you've seen that in some of the efforts to address stigma around HIV. Moving on to violence against women and girls, there is growing evidence from sub-Saharan African countries that shows many forms of intimate partner violence, of physical, sexual, and psychological, increased susceptibility to HIV and disease progression among women and girls. It's not, people often think in terms of physical or sexual violence, but the psychological violence can also be very important. So a group from STRIVE from May 2015 organized the Green Tree 2 meeting, which brought together participants from a broad spectrum, including STRIVE partners and public health researchers, to think about this issue of addressing the structural pathways that influence violence. And so this slide shows key learnings that arose from the meeting and depicts the different direct and indirect ways that violence within intimate partnerships may impact on HIV risk. And there again, this is something there is a report on, which can be found on the website. We've been involved in projects where showing that violence is preventable, MAISHA and SASA, and also drawn on the work of Jennifer Wagmo with SHARE, and also the work, the older work of image trial in South Africa. And this work has shown reduction in violence can be achieved within programmatic timeframes. So just to look at MAISHA trial a bit more, this tells you what the aims were: to evaluate the impact of social empowerment intervention combined with economic interventions on women's experience of past year intimate partner violence. It was a cluster randomized controlled trial, and it was with women who were taking part in a group-based microfinance loan scheme. What we found, the intervention was providing consciousness raising, skills development, greater social capital, and we found that it reduced the levels of physical and or sexual intimate partner violence, the emotional abuse as well, and reduced acceptance and tolerance of gender inequality and IPV. So it actually was addressing some of the social norms that we've been talking about. In India, we had the project Reducing Violence and Increasing Condom Use in Intimate Partnerships of Female Sex Workers in Karnataka. I should say that we are questioned sometimes on why our work with sex workers hasn't focused more on decriminalization. That was a very conscious decision because a lot of work is going on around decriminalization, and we felt there were gaps that we could effectively fill. So we're very conscious that that is a key area, but it's not been a focus of this particular project or other work that we've done with sex workers. So this project was working with women with high HIV prevalence, and working particularly with their intimate partners. So looking at the high levels of violence in intimate relationships. It was a 3-year intervention, and it was really the first to address IPV and low condom use within the intimate relationships of female sex workers. It's often partnerships that are overlooked when people focus very much on the client-sex worker relationship. So the intervention was predominantly with Devadasi sex workers, who you probably know are a scheduled caste group, implemented by a sex worker-led CBO, and involved 800 female sex workers across 47 villages. And you can see the levels of the intervention in the diagram on your right. So it was an evaluation carried out, and the findings showed, interesting, there was no difference in primary outcomes across the arms. And of course that raises alarms always when you have a trial which doesn't show a significant difference. But what was clear from the emerging findings was that maybe some of there was some what I think is often unhelpfully called contamination in a trial, but some influence across the arms because the CBO was working in both the control and intervention villages. But the critical thing was there was lower acceptance of IPV and higher level of self-protection strategies among sex workers, but it also highlighted the difficulty of working with intimate partners of sex workers. And there are some very interesting observations and work coming out of this trial around the concept of dealing with a relationship which is intimate, but it's also within the context of sex work itself for the intimate partner, dealing with that identity for himself and the woman he has the long-term relationship with. So moving rapidly on to adolescent girls and young women. So this is, as I think we all know, a group that remain at disproportionate risk of acquiring HIV, and there are a number of behaviors that increase that vulnerability. What I'm going to talk about is the work we have done around transactional sex. One of the things that's critical is defining transactional sex. And this was an important output of the effort of the team who were working on this topic. Transactional sex is non-commercial, non-marital sexual relationships motivated by the implicit assumption that sex will be exchanged for material benefit of status. And that definition is very useful in trying to place the understanding of transactional sex, which is often a term that's used quite loosely. Transactional sex increases HIV risk for young women because it's outside marital, it's outside an established or steady relationship, and it's at a time when people may be particularly for young women exploring new relationships, making alliances, welcoming the presence they may get from that transaction. They can be on average 50% more likely to be HIV positive than sexually active women who have not practiced transactional sex. So in our work, we've worked to improve the evidence of the role of transactional sex in HIV for young women, to improve the understanding of the motivations for transactional sex, and, as I've already alluded to, improve the definition and measurement of transactional sex, to inform structural interventions with young women to address the complex nature and motivations for transactional sex. And what is, I think, particularly important to understand is that, we're not talking about women who are selling sex commercially and therefore may have already been reached by interventions. They may be aware of the need to use condoms, etc. These are often women and girls who do not see themselves as vulnerable or indeed as victims, and are using transactional sex not just to get food, but maybe to get a nice phone or social status, or just to have a relationship with someone, to explore the opportunities from a relationship. They're not necessarily relationships without love, and that sort of is quite critical in how one thinks about reaching the vulnerabilities that are associated with transactional sex because of HIV infection and broader STI infection. So we had the SOMATA intervention to increase secondary school completion and reduce child marriage among adolescent girls from marginalized communities in northern Karnataka and South India. And that was really looking particularly at adolescent girls from the marginalized communities who may be entering sex work early, but then may also be, because they are marginalized, often poor, may be looking for opportunities for transactional relationships in order to improve their livelihoods. So this was aimed to improve the overall quality of life of adolescent girls from marginalized communities. So a cluster randomized trial in 2 districts, as I've said, reaching 129 schools, 2,457 girls. I won't go into the flow diagram on the right. You can read that yourselves or later. So the findings: there's no difference in primary and secondary outcomes by trial arms. So another one which you may call a flat finding. But the interesting thing, in one of the 2 districts, there was increased secondary school entry and completion associated with SOMATA, and there was a positive influence of interventions on some of the intermediate outcomes. So there's improved social networking and uptake of skills and training. So we identified there's a need to work with the most marginalized and vulnerable girls and families in society, but then we need a multi-level intervention to reach those who are being left behind. So it needs a sustained effort to reach and help these girls. Moving quickly on to the structural barriers to biomedical interventions, a lot of store has been placed on PrEP and ART, the biomedical interventions that have been lauded as being the way to end AIDS. And what is very clear, that you cannot end AIDS without addressing structural factors, because they shape HIV risk and undermine uptake and effective use. If you look at the treatment cascade, this is a little dated from 2016, but the flow is still indicative of what is going on. You've got 100%, if you like, of people living with HIV, but actually there is a break point of those who are actually not being diagnosed, so encouraging and supporting and helping access to testing. And then there is that gap between testing and getting onto ART. For some people, they need some time to think, but others may actually really be uncertain how to get onto ART, or perhaps simply think that they are not sick enough to get ART. There are many barriers to taking up ART, and then further drop off with people remaining virally suppressed. It's, I think, too easy for donor organizations and others to say, you know, oh, we've got all of these people onto ART, and not recognize the critical need to sustain and support people to stay on ART across a lifetime. And if you're an adolescent living with HIV, that can seem very daunting indeed. So in South Africa and Tanzania, the Empower trial was undertaken. It was a combination HIV prevention intervention that includes oral PrEP for adolescent girls. So it was undertaken in places where adolescent girls and young women, HIV prevalence 3 times higher than among young men, and violence is prevalent. And there is a potential for PrEP to be potentially empowering for HIV prevention technology for young women. But violence is critical for leading to non-uptake as well as poor adherence. So we need data to guide GBV screening and linkage to care into HIV prevention, and strategies to support PrEP uptake and consistent use. So the STRIVE funding added to other funding for this trial, which was with sexually active women, 16 to 24, it being HIV counselling and testing. You can read the flow diagram, and those who are HIV negative getting on to PrEP, and then linkage to care for gender-based violence as well to address that. So the PrEP uptake was very high, but PrEP continuation declined to 60% at month 6. And there was no difference between standard support and enhanced support arms. Again, understanding why that is quite critical for future ideas for how this intervention may be taken up. Lifetime experience of violence was high. Integrating gender-based violence screening into HIV testing and counselling service is feasible and acceptable. This trial showed, and it also showed it's possible to deliver oral PrEP as part of a combination HIV prevention program. And the women were keen to use new forms of HIV prevention that they can control, because they were acutely aware of their HIV risk, and they really wanted to protect their health and their futures. And the empowerment clubs, it's the Empower trial, the empowerment clubs that were provided were highly valued as places for the women involved to get together and be able to support each other. Alcohol is just one example of other areas that we have looked at. Alcohol misuse contributes to the risk of acquiring HIV. I think that's commonly known. And combating the harmful use of alcohol requires structural interventions that cross-cut development sectors. I'm going to talk about a 3-country study. These are some of the people who have been involved in that. And they were looking at youth and alcohol marking and availability. And this just gives some illustrations of alcohol advertising, and the voices of a young person from South Africa just saying, you know, just by looking at the image of alcohol, you feel like trying it. And then the gendered advertising that I think those of us who work in Africa are very familiar with, you know, the idea that it's very masculine to drink a particular beer, or it's very feminine to drink another sort of beer that's supposed to be lighter and more friendly to women. So this idea of marketing being very seductive for young people who are wanting to aspire to a certain lifestyle. Advertising in India has interestingly been restricted, but it's quite widespread in many other places, including South Africa and Tanzania. And what this work showed was that the alcohol outlets and adverts were often very near schools within a 500-meter radius. So what the team who are involved in this work have been doing with others is getting the evidence out there to contribute to a ban that has been put in place in Tanzania against these alcohol sachets, these small plastic containers of often very potent alcohol. And in South Africa, evidence being absorbed by the Southern African Alcohol Policy Alliance in their advocacy work, and contribution to the Liquor Act amendment efforts. So really trying to provide the evidence to influence at the structural level. If you think back to our conceptual framework, trying to get in at the top of that framework. Then to development synergies and co-financing. Now this was the topic, I think, of the last Learning Lab, so some of you probably have that perhaps still fresh in mind. And there, this is again looking at opportunities to add benefit to other initiatives to address development and the sustainable development goals, which we've got here on the right. And the key social and structural drivers can be included in interventions for them, investment opportunities through multiplying the impact through the development synergies. If you can add critical components to other work going on to address the sustainable development goals. So if you look at this, you've got on the left HIV, you've got on the right development. So if you've got an HIV intervention that's looking at biomedical and behavioural intervention, you can add a structural element to that HIV programming, which may actually speak to one of the SDGs. So perhaps maybe it's around livelihood, maybe it's around something to do with addressing the treatment of disease, etc. So that those additional values can be added. If you can achieve HIV benefits from development programs, again, by adding in an additional component to a development program that can be directly addressing HIV. So if you look here, the idea of co-financing is, I think, fairly intuitive. You've got often a very siloed approach to the way things are funded. So a sector may have some money for a program, another sector some money, another sector money. But if they stay separate, then they're not going to be able to fund that intervention. But if they are able to find a way to work together, this co-financing, then that program can then be funded. So this work, led by UNDP and supported by funding from the Japanese, has really been looking at how co-financing can save governments money by improving resource efficiency, investing in high-level interventions that hit multiple SDG targets, which is something a lot of governments are very keen to show that they are doing and being able to do. There are ways to look at the interconnected SDGs, bringing governments, bringing sectors in government together for that co-financing to work more efficiently, and then actually the point that it actually does not require additional funds if different sectors work together to pool those public resources they have for funding these interventions that are trying to address the SDGs. So as I said, with funding from the Japanese government, this project has been working in these countries. It's assisted the development of costed co-finance models and plans, and it's provided countries with follow-on technical and other support needed for implementation. And there's a guidance note and a lessons learned publication, which you can find on the website. So again, this is something that's trying to come in at the macro level to try and look at ways in which development itself that does not seem to be directly health related may have and can have a health benefit by being linked up at a government intervention level. You can think of climate change. Addressing climate change can have profound influence on health and well-being if those sort of areas are taken into account in the many climate change initiatives that are currently going on. So finally, Strive set out in 2011 to keep structural drivers on the HIV agenda, and we think through our research and synthesis of the existing evidence base, we have contributed to the increased priority and prominence of structural factors in efforts to address the epidemic. But we're not complacent. There is an awful lot still to do, and we hope, as Annie said at the beginning, that the website remains a very useful resource and others can continue to build on the work that we have done. Thank you.
Thank you, Janet, for the excellent presentation. So I can see we have here a comment, a question from Andrew. It's great work. I was wondering what the key outstanding or more specifically next set of big questions that follow on from Strive work.
I think, Andy, you could answer that as well as anybody. I mean, I think that key outstanding questions, some of the things that we have been thinking about is trying to look more at the influence of power on relationships and the drivers, if you like, of some of the remaining structures. I mean, power can be in terms of the alcohol industry, but also within intimate partners relationships. But then also the importance of understanding finance and economics and behavioral economics more. But there are lots of areas, and I think that we at the moment are scarcely taking a breath as we sort of wind things up. But that, I think, is a critical area to carry on thinking about. I don't know if Saidi wants to add anything.
No. Thank you, Janet. I think you touched on. Hello. Okay.
Hello.
Okay, I just wanted to be sure I'm heard. You touched on quite a few already. I can see here in Mwanza one of the two of these areas which we are keen to continue exploring is the continuing interest to find ways in which we can address violence, specifically intimate partner violence, and how can we take the lessons which are coming out here into sort of mainstream sort of combination HIV prevention programs. And we have also been extremely interested in extending the work and looking ways in which we can actually get men involved in these activities. I think another major area which we are still keen to continue working on this as a follow-up to what we have done is to really continue engaging key policymakers to see how we can draw in the work on policy development in Tanzania where we are working, but also influencing policy developments in other settings where you have the epidemic of harmful alcohol use and abuse of other substances, but also at the same time a major ongoing HIV epidemic. So there is quite a range of topics here which will seem to be important to build on what we have been doing in the consortium. I see another question on the screen. This is from Zambia, I guess. Yes, this is from Ellen Mubanga, specifically asking, I'm interested in the co-financing. How do I get in touch with the program in my country? This is Zambia.
So Ellen, on the website, you'll find the co-financing brief, and then the links for you to be able to contact UNDP collaborators through that. And if any problem, then just get in touch with us at Strive.
Yes, we have another question. This is from Gabriel Delicchio. Thanks for the presentation. Key challenge we face is how to justify investment on structural barriers with focus and investment on treatment. I think maybe, Janet, you can comment on this, but in my view, there is also quite a lot of evidence that there are a lot of these structural barriers do actually make it harder for us to reach the care and treatment targets. So there is a very good evidence, actually, we can say, in order to be able to address those breakpoints which you have showed in some of the slides, we actually need to be addressing this, and this is going to be a good investment in helping us to reach those treatment targets, rather than being a distraction to treatment programs. I don't know if, Janet, you want to.
I understand where Gabriel is coming from. I mean, it's the if you like the biomedical interventions, the PrEP and the ART seem, that people are often so reliant and so hopeful that they are the answer, and often, sadly, it's only when it's clear that the number of people getting onto treatment or taking up PrEP is not that straightforward that then people begin to look at the investment on the structural barriers. So it's often when resources are short, critical to get the evidence up, as Saidi has been mentioning, the evidence out on how beneficial the investment in structural barriers, addressing the structural barriers can be. But I think it's work in progress.
Okay, Janet. Another question, this is from Shireen. What is the current thinking on how best to measure impact of mass media on social norms, given that RTCs are not ideal for evaluating such interventions? Janet, do you have any insight?
Well, I think this is we were reflecting last week actually on how times have changed since Strive began, and mass media and social media and so forth was really not so available in some of the places that we've been working 8-9 years ago. And I think if we were starting again now, this would be a very critical area. You only have to look at the influence of the mass media on alcohol advertising and the way that influences norms to see the importance of trying to look at that. I completely agree, RTCs are not ideal. Often you need more of a realist evaluation to look at what is actually going on in a context and understand that, and being able to trace that a bit over a period of time to look at the points where an intervention is possible. But I think that is an area that a lot more work is required.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Perhaps just for my own understanding, when we talk of mass media during this period of technological advancements, I'm assuming we include all sorts of things which are online platforms and digital platforms, because we used to think of mass media before to be the mainstream.
Yeah, indeed.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Good. Yeah. The next question is: did the MAISHA study look at whether there was greater impact on outcomes by combining violence prevention with microfinance than independent interventions? I think at this time there are 2 trials actually which have been done as part of the MAISHA study. We have results from the first trial, which involved all women in a microfinance scheme. So in that trial, we were testing whether adding violence prevention will help. So we really can't assess the impact of microfinance because everyone is on the scheme. But the second trial is being done on women who are not in microfinance scheme, again testing the violence prevention curricula. We hope we will have results by the end of the year, and that will be able to give us insights of whether this works in women who are not in microfinance scheme. So we don't have data which can tease out whether microviolence scheme or violence prevention, which one is important. Good. And Ellen Banga, thank you. This is to you, Janet, for a nice presentation, I guess.
So Gabriel has come back at the bottom.
Okay.
Yeah. So Gabriel, I think we need to put you in touch with UNDP, I think.
Yeah. Yes, UNDP actually was quite actively involved from New York. I assume also within the country we can bring that link. Good. And another thank you to you, Janet. That was
well, I
great.
think that's to everybody. So.
Okay, so some links provided for more about the impact of strive research and so on. Yes. Janet, just to maybe one more question, which is coming in a more traditional way, is not typed on the screen. This is about the work on stigma. I know you were part of the pop art work. Are there going to be further results which actually will show whether the pop art intervention or an example of a biomedical intervention have actually impacted stigma? Will there be some evidence?
Yes. So this is the opportunity for the advert, is it? So at the AIDS Impact conference in London on the 29th of July, there's a special session which is devoted to the sharing of the findings from pop art on our findings on stigma. And there are certainly, as we speak, Anne Stangl, James Hargreaves and others are busy writing papers to get the findings out there as quickly as we can. So more soon.
Okay. And also, I'm assuming within the same trial, they will also check whether stigma influenced the uptake of the test and treat and stuff.
Yeah.
So
as far as we're able. Yeah.
Okay. Good. That is quite exciting. Waiting to hear that. I don't see any other question online. So I think at this stage, I would like to thank everyone for taking part in this. And as you can see, there are a lot of resources online. But also, just to make sure all our previous Learning Lab presentations, they are available at Strive websites, along with a series of materials addressing issues on structural drivers. Finally, you'll see a feedback form at the end of the call. It provides us with an important information to guide the Learning Lab series. So please do take a minute or so to fill it out. So once again, many thanks for Janet for making the presentation and for all the people who have taken part in this. And to Annie and Michael and Becky for helping to set up the lab. Many thanks.